There was an ethos and an ideology to craft, at least at the beginning. A lot of it was tied up in sticking it to the man. People felt that their lives were controlled by corporations.
We start to see the shift where it's increasingly all drinkers who are being targeted, not just people who might be considered to have a problem with alcohol. And the way in which that message is shaped and crafted is around the idea that you could be drinking sensibly.
Wine, for many people, becomes part of this lifestyle, and lifestyle is partly about aspiration. Who do I want to be? How do I want to be seen by others?
Craft, innovation, a changing world, healthy drinking. These are all themes that we'll be exploring today as we conclude our series on the history of alcohol. This episode is about the here and now.
The production and consumption of alcohol have undergone huge changes in the 20th century, but we're going to see that it's in the last 60 years that things have started to spin off in new and different directions. I'm Professor Phil Withington.
And I'm Dr. Nick Groat, and you're listening to 5.5 Moments When Alcohol Shaped the World, and we're calling this episode Half a Moment.
I mean, as a historian and an archaeologist, our job is to reflect on the past, but today we are talking about the present, so we thought we should play it safe and call this half a moment, or a moment that's not yet over.
To get going on today's journey, we've come up with a very appropriate place to start. Portland Works in Sheffield, once a centre for manufacturing in the heart of the old industrial city, and now the home of several artisanal makers. And up these rather narrow and tricky steps, believe it or not, is a distillery.
This is the main distilling room of Locksley Distilling, an independent company established by Cynthia King and John Cherry in 2013. It's here that they and their team make a range of high-quality Locksley gins, as well as liqueurs, vodkas and rum.
When it opened, Locksley Distilling was in the vanguard of what has become known as the gin-nascence. This is a moment when the supply of gin by a few big multinationals was seriously challenged by small craft producers, and gin suddenly became a seriously fashionable tipple.
We would consider ourselves a craft distillery, but there is really no legal definition of the word craft, and I'm not sure if there can be, because I think a lot of people conflate the words craft and small, and you don't have to be small to be craft, and you don't have to be craft to be small. We're not a big distillery by any stretch, but there are a lot of micro distilleries now. We're definitely bigger than that. I think at our peak we had 13 employees, and now we have about 9. So we are employing people, we're paying people's wages, we're paying our own wages. So we're not a micro distillery in somebody's garden shed.
I asked Cynthia whether Locksley Distilling had an ethos and how she would characterise it.
Ethos are important to us. We do want to make sure that everybody's getting paid a fair wage. We do want to make sure that the environment is looked after. We are not certified organic or certified B Corp or certified anything really, because it takes a lot of money and bureaucracy to get all of those things, and we'd rather put our money into making good products and talking about them. We've always felt that everybody should do for the environment what they can.
Looking around the room at the many bottles and sacks of fresh botanicals, the fruits and herbs that flavour Locksley's different gins, and the state-of-the-art technology used to distill the liquors, I'm reminded of a laboratory as much as a workshop. I asked Cynthia whether innovation is an important part of what she and her husband John do.
Yes, innovation is definitely important. I think for me, not coming from gin being the be-all and the end-all, I love flavors, I love to cook, I love experimenting with things. Things I've tasted 15 years before I ever did any distillation have found their way into our flavor range. If I go to a restaurant and I see a weird combination on a menu, I have to try it because the chef put it there for a reason. He's not going to put something on the menu that's not going to work. Our raspberry and cardamom gin was inspired by a panna cotta that had a raspberry and cardamom coulis, because they're two flavors that prior to that I never would have put together, but they work so well together. There you go.
So whilst we were talking about flavours, it seemed rude not to try some.
So you smell it. So I definitely get the tomato in there and the chilies, and it's just the combination of all of them. I just love it. So cheers.
The first thing we sampled was Bloody Mary vodka, and I can tell you it had quite a kick at 3 in the afternoon.
So we distilled every element of a Bloody Mary individually, and then we blended it together and created this Bloody Mary vodka. So in it, there's tomato, there's lemon, there's lime, there's horseradish, there's celery,
Whilst we tasted the vodka and followed it with chocolate chili rum that Cynthia was developing, she told us about her preference for quality over quantity, both in terms of making the spirits and drinking them.
I think that, drinking better, not more, is good. So that fits right in our wheelhouse because we do make premium products, but we are incredibly proud of the flavors. But you can have 1 gin and tonic in an evening or 2 gin and tonics in an evening and then not continue drinking all night long. Whereas some of the alcopop type things, I think, are aimed at people that just want to go down to the pub and drink too much. We've always thought drinking in moderation, but if you're going to be drinking in moderation, you should drink well.
Talking to Cynthia, you get a real sense of her passion for her distillery and how making innovative and delicious liquors that are still recognisably gin or rum or vodka combines great individuality and skill.
From the other perspective, the perspective of the consumer, the reason for making these new drinks was to give people genuine alternatives to the 6 big and very similar brands that dominated the market before the ginnaissance.
And drinking these new gins was a kind of lifestyle choice as much as anything. And many of the things Cynthia has mentioned, sustainability, quality, innovation, passion, individualism, are some of the key attributes of the modern craft alcohol movement.
So is this the start of another moment in our series of moments when alcohol shaped the world? Or is it the continuation of a moment that started several decades ago before the craft movement took off? Exactly when did alcohol first begin to be explicitly linked to individuality and lifestyle choices in new and maybe revolutionary ways? Pete Brown is a journalist, author, and award-winning beer writer. I asked him about the relationship between alcohol and advertising.
Well, that was my introduction to beer, really, was working in advertising myself. I was at school in the 1980s. And at that time, I guess there was a gap somewhere between the end of things like Monty Python and the start of the new alternative comedy boom of the comic strip and the young ones. And during that period, the beer ads were the funniest things on television. So you'd go into school the next day going, "Oh, did you see it? Did you see it? Did you see the new Carling ad?" And you'd be chanting the slogans from the ads and so on. You don't get that anymore because they're worried that it'll encourage children to drink. And I can say from my personal experience, it didn't encourage me to drink, it encouraged me to work in advertising.
Beer advertising in the UK and USA was something that took off in the 1950s and 1960s, when the 6 big breweries of the day turned to the new medium of commercial television to compete for and increase their share of the market.
Beer is pretty much the only product where in advertising you're not allowed to talk about the product benefit. You're not allowed to say that it gets you drunk. You're not allowed to say that drinking in any way makes you more relaxed, sociable, sexually attractive, anything like that. You're not allowed to say there's any benefit whatsoever from drinking beer. And so what you had to do as advertisers was find another way of talking about the product. And we created brands. Beer is really important in the history of branding because by the 70s you had a lot of interchangeable lagers as far as the beer itself was concerned, and you built them through personality. It not only kind of changed the beer landscape, it changed the advertising and the marketing landscape of the UK in a much, much broader way.
Through the new power of TV advertising, beers that were often identical to each other in terms of quality and taste were now branded with mock personalities, like the funny Carling Black Label ads and the matey Hofmeister Bear, designed to appeal to the self-perceptions and aspirations of audiences. The wine writer and historian Professor Steve Charters identifies the 1960s and 1970s as a seminal moment for the wine industry too.
I think that period from the late 60s, 70s, whatever, up until 2008 was a moment where wine was having an influence on the world, and certainly it was very symptomatic of the way the world was changing. What you have in the immediate post-war period is that countries that drink wine and make wine are just recovering. I mean, we're talking about Germany, Italy, Spain, France, especially. They're just recovering from the war. But then a whole series of things come together to change that. And the first thing that changes is consumption. And wine moves from being a large volume drink that Southern Europe is consuming in large quantities. You know, the consumption per person in France per year in 1960 was 120 litres. That's over 2 litres per person per week. That's incredible. And that dies away. And what we move towards is a much bigger, a broader form of consumption.
Professor Charters goes on to say that the main thing behind that change happened in the mid-1970s. Suddenly, supermarkets everywhere could stock wine.
What it does in France, it means that people are no longer just drinking what is made locally, what's made in their village, that they can go and get from the cooperative. In the UK, what it does is say to people who previously thought, look, wine is a drink really for the aristocracy and the upper classes. It says, you can all have it. It's here in Sainsbury's, it's here in Tesco's, it's here in Safeways. It's widely available. And there's a series of other things that are happening at the same time that really play into this. The growth in travel, you know, people who've never travelled abroad before suddenly taking their holidays in the south of Spain and then maybe Italy or Greece. And they get to see that people naturally drink wine. So people's perspectives become broadened at a time when wine becomes much more widely available.
Also important to the new accessibility of wine is more people are making it.
What you then see in the 1970s, and especially in the 80s and 90s, is the threat to European producers from New World production. It is part of this important moment from about 75 to 2008, where Australia, the USA, particularly to start with, then New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, Chile, all start to produce lots of wines that are available globally.
And just as beer advertising gives a nudge to the self-identity of consumers, so wine becomes a marker of lifestyle choices.
This is a really important point, because what happens is that it seems that class constraints begin to break down a bit. It's not that they cease to exist, but they become a lot more fluid. And the idea of lifestyle as people's way of identifying who they are, which communities they belong to, becomes a lot more important to them. And with lifestyle, they're free to break out of the fact that I am working class, therefore I drink beer. They can say, actually, I can choose to do other things. I can choose to eat foreign food. I can choose to drink different things. I can have coffee rather than tea. And wine, for many people, becomes part of this lifestyle. Wine is an aspirational drink, and lifestyle is partly about aspiration. Who do I want to be? What do I want my identity to be? How do I want to be seen by others?
These appeals to lifestyle choice and increases in production contributed to a general increase in consumption levels.
My research specialism is the history of public health, particularly in Britain since 1945. I'm particularly interested in the history of substance use, so alcohol is one of the things I'm especially interested in.
Alex Mould is a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
After World War I and the measures that had been introduced in order to restrict alcohol consumption, then consumption never really increased till the 1960s. There are lots of reasons for that. It's partly to do with some changes in the licensing laws and the ability to be able to buy alcohol in a wider range of places like the supermarket, changing sort of social laws, increasing consumption of alcohol by women, diversification in the kind of alcohol products that were available. So consumption starts to go up. And obviously, as it starts to go up, you tend to get more problems associated with drinking. And so it becomes a kind of legitimate target for public health intervention.
So it wasn't just the drinks industries targeting the aspirations and lifestyle choices of consumers. Alongside advertising, a parallel kind of messaging developed in response to the enhanced consumerism of the 1960s. Initially, there were two kinds of alcohol-related problem that attracted the attention of government, or by a state, as we described it in the last episode. The first was drink driving.
In 1967 in Britain, Barbara Castle brings in the breathalyzer, so a technology that allows the police to determine how much alcohol is in the bloodstream. And alongside that, there's regulations about how much alcohol you can and can't consume before you get behind the wheel. There's a whole host of public health campaigns then around trying to get people to stop drinking and driving, or drinking within a certain limit so that they don't pose a danger to the public when behind the wheel and being intoxicated.
Drinking and driving are dangerous. 4 single whiskies and the risk of accident can be twice as great. 6 singles and the risk can be 6 times as great. 8 and the risk can be 25 times as great. If he's been drinking, don't let him drive. Don't ask a man to drink and drive.
And the other strand relates to this rising consumption, and scientists start to notice that there's also a corresponding rise in liver disease, particularly cirrhosis of the liver, which by that point they know is linked to the consumption of alcohol.
Government health messaging appealed to audiences to make different lifestyle choices to those advertised by the drinks industries.
Initially, the focus is on what might have been called heavy drinkers or even alcoholics. So it's targeting people that consume a large amount of alcohol. And it's about the kind of health dangers, but also about the notion that consuming too much alcohol is a disease in and of itself. So it's targeting people who might have been traditionally thought of as having a problem with alcohol. And that's in the 70s. But then things start to change in the 1980s, and there starts to be more of a shift to thinking about not just very heavy drinkers, but sort of more moderate drinkers, and really to everybody, to thinking about how you can encourage everybody to consume a bit less alcohol.
This change in messaging was designed to encourage moderation among all drinkers, rather than highlighting the dangerous drinking of a few.
And the way in which that message is shaped and crafted is around the idea that you could be drinking sensibly. So there are sort of sensible limits to which the amount of alcohol you consume. And so we see the introduction of the unit measure, so the idea that there's a certain amount of alcohol per volume, and you can consume so many units, and that's within a kind of recommended safe levels or sensible levels of consumption.
But there's another change in focus at the end of the 20th century, when changes in the licensing laws and promotion of the nighttime economy encouraged messaging reminiscent of the gin craze in the 18th century.
There's a big sort of almost like a moral panic, essentially, about binge drinking in the late 90s, early 2000s, which isn't necessarily related to actually who's consuming the most alcohol. That still tended to be middle-aged people who were mostly drinking at home. But that drinking, of course, is more hidden. It's more difficult to see. And so the media kind of really get involved in this sort of publicising this, and there's lots of kind of imagery, and it's focusing particularly on women, and there's the long kind of connection back to the 19th century and beyond about vulnerability and sexual vulnerability, particularly when over-consuming alcohol, and also about sort of policing female behaviour and saying these women they're behaving badly, they're kind of ladettes, they shouldn't be out in public having fun and drinking to excess. So there's a change in kind of targeting, and there is a little bit about trying to target binge drinkers, but it's also this sort of media and kind of popular concern that springs up in that late 90s, 2000s period.
So from the 1960s, we can see two kinds of pressure on audiences. Advertisers for multinational companies promoting lifestyle choices based on product branding, and health campaigners encouraging and sometimes scaring people to think about the consequences of their lifestyle choices.
And it's in response to these pressures, and especially the focus on lifestyle choices, that two of the biggest trends in 21st century drinking cultures seem to have developed. the craft alcohol movement, and the healthy drinking movement.
That's certainly the case for healthy drinking. I think almost all the experts we've talked to have noted the rise of no alcohol and low alcohol drinks as a defining feature of the contemporary moment. And it's interesting what Professor Mould has to say about it.
I think from a public health perspective, you see the rise of the notion that there is no safe limit of alcohol consumption. So that's something I think we've started to see a bit more in the last 5 or 10 years. People have been saying it for a long time in the public health world, but I think some of that messaging is starting to cut through. So the idea that, yes, there is a kind of recommended, maximum, but actually it would be better if you drink less than that, or even ideally don't drink at all, or to very low levels.
There are lots of factors behind this trend, of course, and not all of them are to do with health. There's an unprecedented choice of intoxicating substances that are not alcoholic, for example, and plenty of alternative venues to take them in. This range of factors is making a new kind of market for the drinks industry to deal with.
And to some extent, I think you see that in the way the industry has responded as well. So you see the rise of low and no alcohol beverages. That's partly, I think, driven by changes in the market, but also, I think, trying to get ahead or get into different markets where alcohol is more restricted, but they can still sell their 0 or low percentage drinks. So the industry is, I think, reflecting that change away from everyone consuming a lot of alcohol to fewer people consuming perhaps a bit less alcohol.
As the industry in general has tried to stay ahead of the game and to anticipate the next trend in the market, so too has the craft alcohol movement, which we talked about with Cynthia at the start of the episode.
While Cynthia and John are distillers, craft as a movement began with American home brewers in the late 1970s. From the very beginning, craft brewers and drinkers embraced the basic idea, encouraged of course by advertisers, that alcohol and individual lifestyle choices were closely linked. However, they did so by rejecting the values, products and lifestyle choices advertised by the 3 big brewing corporations which dominated the market in the USA and the 6 big breweries that monopolised UK production. Here's Pete Brown again.
There was an ethos and an ideology to craft, at least at the beginning. A lot of it was tied up in sticking it to the man, championing small producers. That wasn't just a beer thing, but I think people felt that their lives were controlled by corporations. They themselves were working for corporations and felt that they had no sort of identity or meaning in their jobs. It's extraordinary how many craft brewers I know who gave up their previous job, and that job was either in finance or in IT. There was just something about looking at screens and spreadsheets every day where people said, I can't do this anymore. I need to put some overalls on and work with my hands and do something real. So the kind of anti-corporate stance is a political one and also a personal one. It's about small scale. It's about meeting people. It's about supporting local businesses. And that was really a huge motivation, on top of the fact that the beer itself was life-changingly good.
Professor Charters identifies another dynamic in the story of democratisation and individualisation.
In one sense, the rise of social media as a medium for talking and exchanging about wine fits absolutely into what I was saying earlier about lifestyle and indeed the breakdown of class. 35 years ago, if you were interested in wine, you read 1 or 2 of the columns in newspapers, or you might subscribe to a magazine that was designed for people who were probably fairly well educated, very well off, who wanted to think about wine. The wines that were being promoted were the classic class wines, the Bordeaux's, the Burgundies, the Champagnes, the Hermitage. Social media has blown all of that out of the water. What is it now to be a wine journalist? Everyone can be a wine journalist. If you want to look up wine on the internet, you will find 100,000 people writing about wine. And that is part of the modern democratic world. It is part of saying we don't trust the marketers, we don't trust the official purveyors of authority, we trust more our friends, our colleagues, our contemporaries, people who are on our level.
One feature of this democratisation was that certain winemakers and drinkers looked to ideas about the authenticity of production methods and to the terroir, or place, in which the grapes are ripened to define what is good wine.
Terroir In France, it's existed really for no more than substantially for about 80 years. In the English-speaking world, for about 35 years maximum. But people talk about it because they talk about what the monks in Burgundy did and what the bourgeoisie in Bordeaux did all those hundreds of years ago to make their wine. And what we're doing is going back to find out what they did. We have this move towards artisanality. That's part of this tradition. In the past, you did not have big wine factories with lots of large stainless steel tanks. The fact that they make very cheap wine for a lot of people is by the by. It is not authentic. We need the crafted wine, just as the craft beer movement has been, and indeed craft distilling.
But whereas it's innovation that seems to drive craft distilling and brewing, Professor Charters observes that for winemakers, craft is all about rediscovering or even inventing traditional methods.
Everyone's got to show that what we are doing has been made in the same place for hundreds of years, in the same way for hundreds of years. It's tasted the same for hundreds of years, which fortunately is not the case because it would have been a horrible, probably vinegar 100 years ago. This reinvention of tradition is fundamental to the wine industry. I've just had a student who's written a very interesting thesis on how 3 different wineries are recreating methods of thousands of years ago in their winery to show how authentic they are.
It's really kind of warm but mellow.
Yeah.
It's nice.
So
I think
heat
you're going to like these.
shouldn't come through. I'm going to pour another one. Shouldn't come through the distillation process. In theory, you should be able to distill the hottest, like the ghost pepper, whatever the hottest chili pepper in that, and you should be able to taste the flavors of it without the heat when you distill it.
Back in Cynthia's distillery, I asked her if these key attributes which seem to define craft will stay with us, or is this simply another moment which we are passing through?
I think that there will always be people that have passion. There will always be people that have innovation. Winemakers have been passionate about what they've done since the dawn of time. So yeah, nothing can move forward without passion and innovation, right?
So maybe this is the crux of our half a moment. Since the 1960s, we've been living in an era of heightened individualism and consumer lifestyle choices. For many people, the alcohol they make, drink, or abstain from has been crucial in shaping the lifestyles they live and expressing the kind of individuals they are, or want to be. Initially, it was corporate advertising and government messaging which forged these links between alcohol and individualism. More recently, and as a reaction to that, people have been better able to do it for themselves.
Well, that's it. We've come to the end of our series on 5.5 moments when alcohol shaped the world. And after covering more than 80,000 years, I could do with a drink.
Over the 6 episodes, we've gone through plenty of options. You could have fermented fruit or rice beer, wine from the Mediterranean with water, Groat beer or hop beer, palm wine, pitu, wiku or pulque, aquavita, rum and gin, porter and lager, wine from France and around the world, botanical liquors and craft beer.
You know what? I actually fancy a cup of tea.
I'll go and put the kettle on.